And I really can't stress the consumer piece enough. I mean, I think that the reason there are brands that are going in all in on sustainability and the reason that greenwashing does exist is that the consumer is looking for it increasingly. And consumers have so much power. And they really, truly can create the change that they're looking for if they demand it from the brands.
Welcome to another episode of Animalia, where we bring wildlife conservation, climate change, and social justice together to help people connect the dots and get involved. Today on Animalia, we are exploring the dark underbelly of clothing and fashion that most people know very little about, synthetic fibers. Over 60% of all the clothing in the world is made of synthetic fibers, of which nearly all are derived from petroleum-based monomers. That's right. Most of the very clothes you wear are derived from petroleum. We're joined by Alissa Baier-Lentz, co-founder of Kintra Fibers, an incredible new startup that is creating synthetic fibers from natural feedstocks instead of petroleum, and may end up playing a massive role in our fight against the climate crisis. Alissa previously founded Hero Backpacks, a social enterprise company that sold sustainably made backpacks to support girls' education. Through that journey, she learned about the world of synthetics and saw there was a much bigger problem to go solve, shifting the very source of how these products are made and getting the clothing and apparel industry off of fossil fuels. She's one of the most passionate and dedicated entrepreneurs you'll meet. And full disclosure, I'm privileged to be an investor in her company, Kintra. Let's meet Alissa. Well, Alissa, thanks for joining today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And, for context for our listeners, the textile industry, the synthetic textile industry is, I believe, over 50%, right, of the fashion and apparel industry overall.
It is. Synthetic textiles account for 63% of global fiber production. Got it.
And the fashion apparel industry accounts for roughly 10% of greenhouse emissions. And it's worth noting, too, that's not the only environmental impact. That's just the greenhouse gases. There's also water pollution and a number of other issues, fair labor practices that are big problems throughout the industry as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think we often sometimes, it kind of does this as it tries to make sense of climate change for everybody. But we often think of greenhouse gas emissions as the sort of only environmental, like as the primary environmental, condition to monitor. But water pollution is a massive one in the fashion and apparel industry. It contributes a lot to this, not just in the form of plastics and, microplastics that end up in the water supply, but also in, how fashion and apparel is dyed. And there's a lot of, runoff and waste from that as well.
Absolutely. And I think actually one thing that's really interesting that was recently released this year, McKinsey and the Global Fashion Agenda released a study where they went further into depth on the specific aspects of the fashion industry supply chain and how greenhouse gas intensive each different aspect is. And they found that more than 70% of the emissions come from upstream activities, in particular, the energy intensive raw material production, preparation and processing. And then the remaining 30% are generated by downstream activities, which is kind of, the downstream activities, because they are, what the consumer touches, is generally what we tend to think about when we're thinking of emissions. Things like transport, packaging, retail operations, and even the use, like the day-to-day usage and the end of life. But really, the biggest, most polluting part of the industry in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions is those energy intensive raw material production, which accounts for more than 70% of total emissions. So I thought that was, really interesting to highlight. I think that can help the industry understand where to really put innovation to help fix the specific aspects of the supply chain that are a little bit broken.
Absolutely. And then the third kind of the other leg of the problems with the fashion apparel industry, just to set the table for our listeners. So we have the greenhouse emissions, where we're going to talk to a lot and talk about synthetics primarily in this podcast episode. We have the water pollution. We also have waste. I've read different stats. Maybe some of these offhand about what percentage of fashion apparel kind of ends up in landfills and waste, but it's an astronomical percentage. And of course, this has been exponentially increasing in the last 20 years due to fast fashion, primarily when you think of, brands like Zara or H&M, Urban Outfitters, just constantly chasing trends and, creating things that are almost designed to be discarded as soon as they're out of season. So the customer buys something else very quickly.
James, you're right. There's the statistics are all shocking in terms of how much clothing ends up in landfills. The one that I'm aware of that came to mind right away is 84%.
Yeah, it's crazy. So before we get into all that, so it's a problem. And Alissa, you and your company, Kintra, are working on a very, very important solution that I'm really excited to talk about. But let's first start with talking about you. Tell us who Alissa is, the person.
Sure.
Yeah.
So yeah, I started my first business 4 years ago, which is a company called Hero Backpacks. And I was inspired by the Tom Shoes of the world. So the concept of, the fact that you can buy a product and create change for a cause that you specifically care about in the process. So I launched a product. It's a backpack. And with every backpack purchase, we were able to give 1 day of school for a girl accessing education for the first time through a nonprofit partner called She's the First. It was through my work with Hero Backpacks as I kind of started diving deeper and deeper into the supply chain and understanding my own environmental impact of the materials I was using. I wanted to do something more to fix a number of the issues that I found. It was really challenging, actually, as a designer to source materials that were sustainable in the sense that they actually checked all the boxes of a material that I would feel comfortable using. Often I felt like the more that I peeled back the layers of the onion of sustainability claims, the less comfortable I became actually incorporating that material because there was always some sort of negative repercussion. So, for example, the industry is currently, using the concept of using recycled ocean-bound plastic water bottles and actually just downcycling them into textiles. That still perpetuates microfiber pollution. So I wasn't comfortable using any, recycled plastic textiles in my production because of this secondary issue that isn't really talked about. And then in terms of, I've never used any leather, but I, started doing custom orders for companies and events, and they wanted leather-like products. And of course, I didn't want to source any leather, but then I found that every leather alternative is made of plastic. And there are increasingly other alternative types of leathers hitting the market using kind of exotic feedstocks, some of various plant sources. Unfortunately, the majority of those still, they might be 70% plant and 30% plastic because they're just not able to create that performance that designers are looking for. So, learning these issues and a number of other issues in the supply chain, I just felt like I couldn't make use of any of the materials out there today. And I also found that if there were materials that I really liked, often they were just too expensive for me to be able to actually incorporate into my designs. And then I met my co-founder, and he has an incredible background in nanoengineering, which is a fancy word, a fun word for material science. And he had actually been working on a chemistry that honestly checked all the boxes in terms of sustainability for what I was looking for, just personally as a designer. And it just made sense for me to jump on board to help him scale it and offer it to other brands and designers.
I am going to, it's funny because I always have to re-ask this question. And I think it's part of the sort of product and the cycle we're in. Yeah, especially as and when you're a startup founder and I do the same thing, kind of live and breathe your life through work, because it's always interesting because what I'm actually asking for is what makes you, Alissa, as a person. And it's funny because every time we ask that question, we get a very interesting, and as if your background is extremely interesting, career answer, but I always have to re-ask it of saying, no, I want to know who you are. Not who you are on LinkedIn, but who you are as a person, what your values are, what you care about. So I'm going to re-ask that question again and ask, who is Alissa?
I have a hard time answering that question because it's hard for me to actually separate myself from my work. It's something I'm working on. I'm learning my boundaries. For example, my my beach jog that I always take, every weekend, a longer one, and at least I try to do it daily, getting out and being out in the environment by the water. But, everything that I do in my work really stems from kind of something that happened in my life. So the reason that I launched Hero Backpacks is I moved to the United States, my family, and I moved to the US from Russia when I was a very little kid, and I didn't speak any English yet. And unfortunately, none of the teachers in the school district that I was in at the time, when we first came here, really picked up on that or noticed it. And so I just kind of, had to kind of absorb and try to learn it on my own. But what that resulted in is just me, one, not actually being able to understand people and just feeling really out of place and feeling like I didn't have a voice, feeling like I just couldn't communicate at all. And when you feel like you don't have a voice, you kind of internalize that you don't matter. And so when I grew up, that's really what prompted me to launch Hero Backpacks was, the best way to empower girls around the world with a voice is through access to education. And millions of girls around the world still don't have access to education today. So I wanted to change that narrative that I lived through for girls that are currently still stuck in that cycle. So for me, I think my work has always been an expression one way or another of who I am and the things that have happened and impacted the journey that I ended up following. And my work with Kintra is really an extension of that. I found that the most impactful thing to do today and just this incredible sense of urgency to fix the climate crisis that we're living in. I think we're all waking up to the fact that this is the most pressing global issue that we're facing. And luckily, I had the experience that would allow me to contribute in one way or another. So I think that's why I have such a hard time answering the question of who I am. And it's easier for me to answer it through my work because it's always the way I've expressed myself.
I've had the pleasure of getting to know you a little bit this year. And so maybe since you have a hard time separating yourself out from your work, I can share what I've gotten to know about you.
Oh.
Obviously you care deeply about the environment and climate. That's very, very clear in all the conversations we have and what you've chosen to do. I think you're a very curious person, has a general kind of curiosity about the world. You have a big heart and you seem to just sort of care about those around you. You seem to value, relationships with people and value the people in your life in a big way. And yeah, I really enjoy getting to know the relationship you have with, sorry, is he your husband or?
Yeah, Morris.
Husband. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's your dynamic together is very enjoyable to watch.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to put this podcast in my back pocket whenever I need like a pick me up.
Yeah. He has a very dry sense of humor. And yeah, you two are funny. Awesome. Well, so, it's in that position you said about, the issue with climate change, which is obviously something we talk about a lot on Animalia. You have chosen to tackle that by tackling one of the biggest contributors in the world, which is synthetic fibers. And I think most people don't realize, I didn't even realize this honestly until, I looked into the space when I started talking to you, was just how much of apparel and clothing comes from synthetic fibers. Like I think a lot of people, along with myself, think of cotton always as everything's mostly cotton, right? We just hear cotton this and cotton that. But the fact that over 50% of clothing, I think you said at the top of the podcast, 63%, is that the right number?
That's synthetics, yep.
Come from synthetic fibers. Can you first explain to everybody what is bundled into the group that is known as synthetic fibers, and what is the other roughly 37%?
Yeah. So actually, if you give me just 1 second, I can pull up the exact numbers. There's this amazing industry, and I can send you this also for show notes. But there's this incredible industry stakeholder group called Textile Exchange, and every year they do a deep dive into the global fiber market, reporting on kind of best practices across all of the fiber categories. In 2019, polyester represented 52% of the global fiber production. And the remaining part of that, in the general 63% of synthetic textiles, is things like nylon and other synthetic textiles that comprise that. And cotton represents 23%. And then there's another category of fibers that are kind of I guess if I said the word man-made cellulosic, people might not know exactly what I'm talking about, but that's like if you hear about eucalyptus fibers or bamboo fibers, that's kind of that category. They're sometimes referred to as semi-synthetics. And then fibers like wool really represent less than 1%, down is less than 1%, and then there's kind of a blanket other, and that's other natural fibers are only 17%.
Yep. So the polyester is 52% of all synthetic fibers of the overall.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. So actual total global fiber production in 2019, polyester is 52% of all fibers made. Other synthetics, so nylon is about just under 5%. Other synthetics are just under 6%. And then you have kind of this general group of more natural materials. Some of these are that man-made cellulosic category. A man-made cellulosic is something like a bamboo or a eucalyptus-based fiber. And then you have cotton and other plant-based. Other plant-based is just under 6%, and cotton is just about 23%.
And I think wool is around 6% or 3% too, right?
Wool is 1% of total
1%.
Global fiber.
Okay.
Actually, sorry, 1.5%.
Got it. And that's obviously trending down over the last few decades. Wool used to be sort of much higher. And so the important thing, right, to table set on synthetic fibers is that for the longest time, it's primarily derived from petroleum. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Still today.
And so help up people and help me understand, how, we go from petroleum to, Nike athleisure.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a great question. And I think this is where, there isn't a lot of visibility into this part of the value chain. I think oftentimes when I, share with friends or anybody that, hey, did you know that your textiles came from oil? Very fun Zoom cocktail conversation. But, oftentimes the answer is no, tell me more. And so basically synthetics come from petroleum, and the starting source, it's really basically the synthetics are effectively a polymer, and a polymer is comprised of monomers, which are kind of, your building blocks. Those building blocks come from petroleum sources. So an easier way of saying it is, the majority of clothes come from petrochemicals. So petroleum, is extracted and then refined into these monomer building blocks that are combined to create a polymer or, kind of a plastic, a resin. That resin is then melted down. And a really easy visual for this is kind of if you think of a shower head. So you melt this plastic down through a shower head like spigot, and then that is automatically circulated into a yarn. And that's how synthetic textile yarns are manufactured. Did that make sense? Because if it didn't, I can kind of repeat that and try to do a more step-by-step approach.
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense. That the big question I have is it sort of the original source petroleum that is also, obviously used for energy that is turned into that monomer, or is it like an offshoot? Is it like a side product of petroleum that then is utilized as a monomer? Or like, when we literally pull oil out of the ground, is it like, some majority of this is going into being burned for energy, and then a small percentage is going to go, some percentage is going to go to being turned into monomer? Or is it the process of burning oil for energy has a byproduct that is then utilized as the monomer?
I don't think it's a byproduct, but I could double check that. My co-founder, Billy, definitely has much more knowledge in the complete step-by-step component, but I'm pretty sure it's just straight up crude oil that's being extracted and then put into this process.
Got it. Either
Although
way, it's obviously petroleum derived.
yeah, and then I was going to say, I mean, the thing is, like, even if it is a byproduct, it's still not the best source. And then one other thing to highlight is, and this is kind of when I was doing my research into the supply chain for my own purposes. If you know, look at the concept of taking those recycled water bottles and downcycling them into textiles, you know, the ultimate source for that is still petro based. So moving away from those traditional sources is really key. Although, and I would love to dive into this a little bit more, not all bioplastics are created equal as well. But that's a different component of the environmental profile of the materials that are actually being used. But we
Got
could
it.
definitely talk about some of the challenges with, you know, I guess I'll just jump into it. Often people think that if something is bio-based, it inherently makes it biodegradable, but that's not the case. So we can kind of talk about those intricacies, but, you know, I think it's important, number one, to move away from petroleum, but to also simultaneously consider the types of materials and monomers that are actually being utilized if you are also going from a bio-based source.
Got it. And I think, yeah, I think the sort of confusion and the fuzziness around bio-based being actual biodegradable or not reminds me similar of in the food industry, the term organic. And that organic is sort of this like catch-all that the industry has adopted to just tell consumers like, this is good for you and the world. Whereas like it's there's no regulation on the word organic really at all. And B, it's such a spectrum of organic farming has such a wide spectrum that, you know, there is organic farming that is not conducive. There's a difference between like organic farming and regenerative farming, right? And not all organic food is necessarily good for you. Something could be organic and still be unhealthy for you nutrition wise. So it reminds me of that in a way.
That's such a great analogy. Absolutely. And I love that you just brought up, you know, regenerative, because that's something that we think about in textiles as well.
Yep. And so the big problem here is that, you know, overwhelming majority of synthetic textiles, which again is the biggest percentage of fashion apparel overall, is derived from petroleum. And we as a planet need to wean off of fossil fuels because it's not necessarily an unlimited resource as some think, and it is causing, you know, just incredible amounts of environmental damage, both in terms of the gas emissions, but also in terms of the damage it causes just to extract it and continue to find new sources of it as we kind of dry up the initial one. So we just need to get off of petroleum, and we already know that from an energy standpoint. I think folks think about electric cars and, you know, all these other, you know, changing the way, you know, we get electricity, you know, moving towards renewables, whether that be solar, whether that be hydro, whether it be wind, you know, whether it be algae and other new innovations coming in that sphere. Fusion eventually, probably, hopefully, will be sort of the biggest driver of our energy grid. But we also need to get off petroleum from a fashion standpoint. And I think that's the big takeaway here is most people have no idea that more than half the clothes that are in their closet are derived from oil.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, you know, I think that one other thing to highlight is, you know, moving away from petroleum is one component, but moving away from petroleum and doing it in a way that incorporates responsible design. So, you know, thinking about material design in a rational standpoint and designing our materials so that they don't have any other negative repercussions, such as microfiber pollution.
Yes. And we could go off on a bit of a tangent here, but I think a lot of people think of also recycled, you know, anything made using recycled plastic, which is another kind of trend in fashion of like this sweatshirt was made of recycled water bottles. We've made that same mistake early on in Animalia and not realizing that these are massive contributors of microplastics every time it's washed and then gets released into the water system. But I want to go back to Kintra and the petroleum for a standpoint. So the big innovation, right, that Kintra, your company, has created is the replacement of oil as a monomer into feedstock as a monomer. Is that the easiest way to kind of summarize it?
Yeah, exactly. So instead of petroleum, Kintra sources are derived from sugar.
Got it. And Walk me through. I think there's first, second, and third generation food stocks, and you're currently in one of them, and you kind of want to progress to another. Can you just kind of walk us through that?
Yeah, totally. So the concept of first, second, and third generation feedstocks is pretty simple. First generation feedstocks are something like corn or wheat. So something that competes with land for food use. Second generation feedstock is something like corn stover or any kind of something that's left over after the harvest. And then a third generation feedstock is something like algae. And each of these can be utilized, at least for Kintra in our supply chain, to make those monomers, make those building blocks that we need. The reason I said we come from sugar is that, we're taking basically sugar as the source that's needed to make those building blocks for us. And we can use any of those feedstocks to, get those sugars from, but we are, kind of beholden to our suppliers. So right now, the industry is using primarily first generation feedstocks, so things like corn and wheat, to make those value added chemicals or those monomers that we would be using in our supply chain. Our vision in the future is something where we can help create a market. The more people that we are working with and showcase that our material is valuable and can be utilized at mass scale, the more we can showcase to our suppliers a new type of feedstock that we want to use. So it's kind of a chicken and the egg. I think a lot of people get kind of hung up and they want to go straight to the perfect solution first, which would ideally be a third generation feedstock. But there's a process of moving industries away from what was once traditional to something that's new and novel. And that requires participation across industry stakeholder groups. It requires participation from chemical companies who are, choosing to use bio-based sources to create these value-added chemicals or building blocks. And then it requires innovators like us to kind of bridge the gap between that industry and the fashion industry that's saying, yes, I'm going to be committing to buying your bio-based yarns instead of petroleum-based yarns. And the more of a market that we have, the more partnership we can build across the industry to kind of exert impact and showcase, instead of using corn and wheat, we would prefer that you use the corn stover. And then, taking it even a step further, once we have, big brands behind us and more industry awareness for this issue, then that kind of gives the chemical companies a reason to move to even a third generation feedstock. So it's a big vision and it requires a lot of cross industry collaboration. But for us, kind of synthesizing this big vision down into things that we can do today, we know that the building blocks that we use today, even though they're coming from first generation feedstocks, are going to be built for this big vision, this big future that we want to be able to help usher in. So everything that we choose as our building blocks or our kind of ingredients in our kitchen, we know that those will be able to be sourced from both first, second, and third generation feedstocks as soon as, we're able to kind of usher in this new way of doing business.
Got it. And the one you're using today, you said is sugar, right?
Well, it's sugar derived from corn and wheat.
Sugar derived from corn and wheat. Got it. That makes sense. Makes sense. And what has prevented the industry from moving this direction sooner? Is there a technology breakthrough that, is part of what makes Kintra special, that, there's just a true innovation that's allowing you to do what you do that didn't exist before? Is it a pricing issue where, deriving monomers this way has traditionally been expensive and you found a way to make it less expensive? Like what has prevented this from happening sooner? Is it a quality issue? And what is the kind of innovation that Kintra's pioneering that makes you bullish on, this becoming a bigger change?
Well, James, That's really insightful because I think it's all of the above. So we can kind of take that step by step. So I guess step one is let's talk about industry infrastructure. There is a lot of innovation happening in these kind of, I guess we'll just call them biosynthetics. So bio-based synthetic materials. I guess first, let me kind of further clarify and define that term. So, a biosynthetic is a synthetic material. So, it follows the kind of same process as a PET or a nylon would, and it uses natural materials instead of petroleum. So that's kind of way that we can describe a biosynthetic. Within biosynthetics, there's a lot of innovation happening. Unfortunately, a number of innovators that have been in the space for a number of years are using really exotic feedstocks that can be challenging to convert to those building blocks. And a number of innovators are setting out to do both that feedstock conversion process, so turning the feedstock, whether it's first, second, or third, into the kind of building blocks used to make the material itself. And that requires a lot of new infrastructure. So I think the reason that we haven't achieved this as an industry sooner is a lot of the approach to innovation has been completely so innovative that it requires new infrastructure build outs and it requires a lot of investment up front. And I think that's always really challenging with getting an innovation off the ground, is if it requires, this high number, this large amount of funding in order to just get it from, just past point A. And so Kintra differs because we're actually able to fit exactly as a drop-in replacement to the existing industry infrastructure out there. And instead of doing that feedstock conversion ourselves, that's where we partner with industry that's out there already kind of moving in a bio-based direction. And then we're, providing them a market to sell these bio-based materials, the bio-based monomers, building blocks that they're making that we turn into a valuable material for, in our case, the fashion industry. So we're kind of bridging being a bridge between industries. And that's really important to highlight, the reason that we are able to scale and successfully serve brands soon is purely an infrastructure play. If we were setting out there to build completely new infrastructure, I think that we would have a very hard and long journey ahead of us. And our perspective is, we don't have time to wait in terms of providing solutions for the climate crisis today. So that's kind of what differs Kintra in terms of, the first aspect is just purely, let's look at existing industry infrastructure and let's make sure that we can utilize it to serve our customers. The second component I think you mentioned is performance. So that's really important. I think there's a number of innovations that get 90% of the way there, and then they just can't meet that remaining 10% of performance. I think a really great example is PLA. That's a bio-based textile that's been on the market for a number of years, but it hasn't had widespread adoption because it's inherently kind of a stiff and brittle material. And that's not exactly what you want in the fashion industry. So, if it doesn't perform just as good as the widely used materials out there, it's just not going to have the adoption that's necessary. And then I guess the third to highlight is affordability, which really ties into that scalability component. I can't stress that enough in terms of the fitting into industry infrastructure. Although we'll start out, as a higher price point as we're kind of ironing out our own scale-up processes and finding those partners that we're going to be working with, we know that we're going to hit economies of scale. And the more people that we service, the more we'll be able to service in the future so that we can help brands that are doing massive production become more sustainable as well.
Awesome. What would you say then is the biggest challenge? You've named a few areas that are the kind of sources of innovation and sort of see change happening across the industry. And to be fair, there's like in a good way that there is momentum across the fashion apparel industry to become more sustainable. I think in the last few years, you kind of can feel it just in working in and around it, which is a good thing. I mean, like you and I both want that to happen across the board. I mean, there's innovations that need to happen on cotton. There's innovations that need to happen on waste and recycling. There's lots of innovations happening in a good way. There's also a lot of greenwashing out there, and a lot of people are kind of capitalizing this moment. We had a whole episode about the kind of greenwashing in fashion and how to spot it. But for what Kintra's doing specifically, and again, introducing this feedstock monomer to replace the petroleum monomer, what is the single biggest challenge you think you're going to have ahead, that you're going to need to overcome to make your dream a reality?
I think it's consumer education. I mean, the greenwashing thing, it really is extremely pervasive, and it's so hard to find, the data out there in a very simple and easy to understand manner. I mean, I think that I'm trying to keep my explanations really clear, but it takes a lot to explain what's happening in the industry, and then second, the key areas for change. And I think the amount of misinformation that's out there, you can make almost anything sound in one way, shape, or another sustainable if you point somebody's attention at one thing, but detract their attention from something else. So I think, overcoming kind of the misinformation that is out there is going to be a really key thing that we're going to have to do. And I think the best thing that we can do is just to lend our voice to highlighting the things that aren't frequently talked about in the industry, both for the consumers and also being kind of a thought partner for our brands. Textile Exchange survey found that only 8% of brands could trace their supply chain back to their chemical suppliers. And yet, as we talked about earlier, 63% of brands or 63% of the global fiber market is dominated by these synthetic materials. So for Kintra, our hope is that we can be kind of this, being able to shine a light into this opaque part of the industry will be incredibly helpful both for brands and for consumers and kind of clearing up some of the misinformation that is out there today.
But does that mean though, and just like my sort of challenge on that is, if the consumer education is what you think the biggest challenge is going to be, then, I infer from that you're saying the consumers need to drive the demand of these more sustainable products versus, the companies themselves, sort of driving that demand by taking the initiative and proactively creating more sustainable products. Is there a world where let's say I think of I know synthetics are big in athleisure, right? Mm-hmm. So I think of the biggest athleisure companies in the world, Nike, Adidas, these folks. If I'm Nike or Adidas and I could today, at the point where I can get a fiber like Kintra for the same price point at the same quality with, much better ratings on sustainability, on lowering my emissions because of how it's derived. What is preventing me from just going all in on that? Why do I need to wait for the consumers to tell me, they want that, if that is available?
I mean, that's a great question. And I think that's one that we're kind of increasingly facing. I think there, are brands that get it. There are brands that have commitment to these sustainability programs all in and completely through. And I think part of the reason that we haven't seen more change happen yet is there really hasn't been a solution like Kintra yet that's ready to go and ready to be integrated into the supply chain. So when I think about our challenges just as Kintra, I think, for us, it's going to be really highlighting how we're better in terms of sustainability across the board and less about figuring out can we integrate with these companies because we know we can. And we designed our materials to be able to do that. And I really can't stress the consumer piece enough. I mean, I think that the reason there are brands that are going all in on sustainability and the reason that greenwashing does exist is that the consumer is looking for it increasingly. And consumers have so much power and they really, truly can create the change that they're looking for if they demand it from the brands.
Yeah. I think they're demanding sustainability and they're starting to, but they're not, it's hard. Like, the reason we're having this podcast, right, is I just don't think a majority of consumers know that A, synthetic textiles are the majority of the industry, and B, that they're derived from petroleum. I think, getting like a lot of consumers to that depth of education to today where people don't consume information much at all. Like we pretty much are creating an era where people only consume 180 characters primarily. I think this is one of the things that keeps me up at night is, how much are we really going to be able to educate consumers beyond just demanding high level things like I want my brands to be more sustainable. But if they don't know the level beyond that, then they're not going to be able to really determine who's sustainable and who's not, and what to actually look for and what to demand for and what not. And I think it's getting harder in a way to educate consumers because of the combination of both lowering attention spans, which we're seeing across the board, and increase of misinformation and the inability to vet that misinformation. And so it's just I think brands like and innovations like what Kintra's doing, I want to believe consumers can drive that demand, but I think it's increasingly hard to educate consumers in a way because of, again, misinformation and lowered attention spans. And so, it feels to me the brands at some point are also going to have to just be proactive and say, we're not going to wait for the consumers to demand we get off petroleum because they don't really know that. We're just going to do that. And we need a partner like Kintra that enables us to do that without sacrificing margin, quality, and the things that, big companies just are unwilling to sacrifice.
Absolutely. And I think that we have hit that turning point, especially this year. I've never seen the word supply chain in more mainstream media news articles than I have this year alone, especially with the fashion industry. There's been high scrutiny with everything that's been happening during the pandemic. And I think that, the consumer is ready, and I think brands are just increasingly recognizing that.
What are your thoughts on, introducing blockchain technology in order to properly track supply chain? This is something I've been pushing for in a while. I've long felt it's a far more, interesting and applicable use of blockchain than cryptocurrency, which is more of a speculative investment vehicle. But, for food and for fashion, we could be using this technology to, track the supply chain of these products that go through many hands in a decentralized way that we can trust, because that's one of the things blockchain enables. But it's weird because I don't see it being adopted, and it seems so obvious to me. Is there something I'm missing on why that isn't a obvious and beneficial solution, or is it that it is, and just the powers that be resist things like that because they want to keep the status quo more or less?
Well, I think it's starting. So I don't know if you've heard of Circular ID by the company Eon Group, Eon ID. Mm-hmm. I think they're based out in New York actually as well. But so they're starting the systems tracking. And for us at Kintra, we love it. We think it's an amazing idea. I think it's vital and necessary in helping get that, both the company and the brand the information that they need to ensure that their supply chain is, completely traceable, and also sharing that all the way through to the end consumer. But increasingly, as we're starting to think about the product end of life as well, having a garment that can be traced and tracked potentially allow us or will enable us and allow us to collect that garment back and turn it back into fiber. So Kintra, we can do that in two different ways. So, be wonderful to partner with a brand on kind of a take back program and collect the garments back that way. And then we could either put that through a physical recycling process or a chemical recycling process. And often when I say chemical recycling, I get kind of like a deer in the headlights look. Chemical recycling, although it sounds scary because it has the word chemical, it simply means, breaking that polymer back down into its monomer building blocks. It's a very simple process. Well, simple, but also intensive. But that is the future of the industry, is incorporating physical and chemical recycling. And so the idea of being able to trace a material isn't just to be able to trace it from its original supply chain. For us at Kintra, it's also a way to keep that in circularity and, be able to actually create new fibers from the materials that we have released in the past. I had an interesting conversation with actually one of our advisors, and he shared with us at Kintra, it sounds like the materials that you make will never be sold. They'll technically always be rented all the way through the end customer, because it sounds like your goal is ultimately to, bring it back to Kintra, to the Kintra lab, or to our manufacturing facility, and respin that and turn that into something new. So again, I'm kind of sharing some big picture vision stuff that we haven't, quite started implementing yet, but knowing that there's companies like Circular ID, Eon ID out there, makes us feel confident that we'll eventually be able to close that loop in that manner.
Innovations like Kintra, we could talk Kintra specifically. So again, the innovation, there's more than this that Kintra is doing, of course, but the primary one being moving off of petroleum-based monomers to feedstock-based monomers. Is the primary impact for that right now the curbing the greenhouse emissions of those end products, which is massive, and even if that is the primary and only impact, it's a huge one. So I'm not meaning to trivialize that, but one of my question is there also any impact that's going to have, do you think, in the other sort of problems with the fashion industry, namely water pollution, the landfill and the waste, and fair labor and practices and conditions?
Absolutely. So I think, petroleum is one big component of it, but another huge component is microfiber pollution, and it's really not talked about enough. And I know I've kind of gone back to this a couple of times in our conversation, but I just really want to highlight that every time that clothes are washed that are made with these traditional synthetic textiles, so things like PET or the recycled downcycled plastic water bottles that are turned into textiles, or are PET, recycled PET, or nylon. So anytime that clothes made with these materials are washed, millions of tiny microfibers are released. And these are tiny plastic particles that, get through the water system, and they end up out in our fresh water and our ocean environments. And I found this shocking. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation reported that the rate of these microfibers getting out into the ocean is equivalent to the volume of 50 billion plastic water bottles per year. And when you think about that statistic, it really makes you question why we started collecting plastic water bottles and putting them back into our oceans in these small microfiber forms. But yeah, it's a huge issue. And that's actually what was kind of the aha moment for Kintra was, the Patagonia put out an incredible study that they found, they studied a number of different garments that they make, and they found that thousands to millions of microfibers come off one single clothing item from one single wash cycle. And so, you can imagine, I guess, pretty quickly how we reach that giant volume that is released annually. But yeah, so the aha moment was this, my co-founder read this Patagonia study, and he's a surfer, and he also happens to be a nanoengineer. He was working at the fast-growing 3D printing company out in the Bay Area called Carbon at the time, and he was kind of working with similar kind of like spandex-like materials. And, he basically just saw this microfiber pollution issue as a materials design challenge that he set out to solve. And so the two theses that he formed was one, can there be a high performing material that doesn't rely on petroleum at all? And two, can there be a synthetic material that has a chemical composition, a formulation that's more like a natural material, so it'll be compostable in nature? And the reason that's important is that materials in a wastewater treatment facility, if a material is compostable, it'll just turn into CO2 and water in that wastewater treatment facility instead of getting through that compost environment and going out to pollute the ocean. And so that was kind of the aha moment for Kintra. And I think it's really important to highlight, it's not just moving away from petroleum. It's also, if we are moving away from petroleum, we shouldn't be making PET or nylon polyamides any longer, because you could make a bio-based PET, but that bio-based PET will still get through that wastewater treatment facility and get out and continue perpetuating this microplastic pollution. So for us, a material needs to be both bio-based and biodegradable, or actually we should be very specific and say compostable in particular. So yeah, the microfiber issue is one that we, is really driving our work at Kintra.
And then last question here. So I think, on an annual basis right now, total greenhouse gas emissions, roughly 50 billion tons. And so if we just do some simple math, and of course, simplifying this for just illustration purposes, if the fashion apparel industry is 10% of that, that's 5 billion tons a year of greenhouse gas emissions from that industry. Now, maybe you've done this with your partner as a fun exercise, maybe not. And this is going to be a hard question to answer top of mind, but I'm just going to ask it anyway, just from a fun curiosity standpoint. Do you if there's 5 billion tons of greenhouse gases emitted per year in the fashion and apparel industry today, if we were to move 100% of the synthetic industry from petroleum to feedstock through, Kintra and other companies, right? Because no one company is going to provide 100% of raw materials. So we need other companies doing the same. If we were to make that switch all together, any sense of what that 5 billion tons of emissions would turn into? Or is it too hard to do that back of the envelope math?
That's a great question, and I wish I had a more simple answer than the one I'm going to give you. It really comes down to considering a number of different elements. So for us, we're hypersensitive and hyper aware of, just making sure, hopefully, that every one of our factory partners operates from a clean energy grid perspective. So, you have to take into consideration a number of different factors when calculating the total greenhouse gas emissions. And I'll share just one other kind of example of why it gets so complicated to kind of do a big estimate like that is some bio-based materials actually release more greenhouse gases than their petroleum-based counterparts. And the reason for that is some monomers are just extremely difficult to make from bio-based inputs, whereas the petroleum-based version, or it's the same monomer, but deriving it from petroleum is such a streamlined and easy process that it doesn't require this multi-step and energy-intensive procedure to go through. So, for example, bio-based PET actually releases more greenhouse gases than petroleum-based PET due to this really carbon-intensive multi-step processing. So it gets really complex when you're kind of trying to compare processes and look at the industry overarchingly. And that's kind of one thing for us, Kintra, is we're always just going to let the science lead us and do the math. And for example, I'll give you one other example on kind of that topic is when we are kind of going back to the circularity and kind of bringing the materials full circle and collecting them and either turning them into fiber through physical recycling or turning them back into our building blocks through chemical recycling. One other component that we'll be considering is it better to actually send this material, this garment, to a compost facility and turn this into fertilizer because of, will the recycling processes be too energy intensive? And if the answer is yes, then the best end of life for that material is, to be composted industrially. So it really depends on partners across the entire value chain. It depends on the energy grid that a lot of this sits on. And, that's some of the considerations that have to be made when you look at the supply chain as a whole.
All right. Yeah, it's a very detailed answer. And I understand why it's hard to just come up with a number. Yeah, I go back and forth myself between, wanting to give people and listeners and also the people I talk to, the kind of the true detailed response, but also recognizing sometimes I need to give them just like a simple data point to take with them that they can remember. But I think the big takeaway here is, the fashion apparel industry is a huge contributor to the environmental, hazards out there and to the climate crisis, both, in terms of greenhouse gases, in terms of water pollution, in terms of waste. And, a big part of that is synthetics and textiles, as you mentioned, that account for 63% of the fibers in that industry. And then nearly, all of them to date are derived from petroleum monomers, and very thankful to see Kintra out there working to change that because, if you get this right, yeah, it can sort of have a massively significant impact on climate change. And climate change is just one of those things that there's no silver bullet. There is absolutely no silver bullet in climate change. I liken climate change to mental health in a way, in that like neither of these kind of big epidemics we're facing have a silver bullet solution where it's like, oh, we just do this one thing and then it's solved. We need to be combating them and solving them from so many different angles simultaneously. And I'm glad Kintra is playing its part in doing so.
Thank you. And sorry if I get way too detailed about considering all of the different components that need to be working together to really impact change in the industry. But, it's true. You can't just look at one solution in isolation. You always have to look at, what is the best move and the best path forward. And sometimes it might have surprising results when you actually start peeling back the layers of that onion, as I mentioned earlier, what inspired me to kind of start this work in the first place.
Yeah, no, don't apologize for being detailed about your work ever. No, absolutely not. Well, awesome. We usually just finish with a couple rapid fire questions. I'll ask them and just tell me the first thing that comes to your mind. It'll be pretty simple. So first question is, what is one book you recommend in the world of environmental or climate change that, has had an impact for you that you think other people should read?
Drawdown.
Paul Hawkins' Drawdown?
Yes.
Yeah, got it. And what is one film, could be, or docuseries that, same question on a film or docuseries that you think should be watched? That's not like, let's avoid the sort of like super well-known things like Planet Earth. What's one that you think that has also had an impact on you that you think other people should check out?
Well, for me, My Octopus Teacher. I love those. They're just my favorite creatures in the world. And hard to say that, but I truly love them. And I just think, for me, having this beautiful imagery of somebody out in the water was really impactful.
Absolutely. We at Animalia love the octopus and have written a whole newsletter dedicated to them before. So it's a huge love of mine. Okay, third question. What is your favorite wildlife?
Gosh.
Non-domesticated, non-human animal.
Well, I would usually say octopus, but I already said that. I mean, I guess actually funny that this came to mind. I wasn't expecting this, but a bear, even though I had a sensitive moment with a bear, I think that just led me to have much more respect for the creature.
Yeah. Any particular species of bear or just bears in general?
Well, the moment that I had was with a black or brown bear, and they were beautiful as a mama and two cubs. And I think we kind of startled them a little bit, and they startled us. But yeah, I guess now I have a forever kinship, so to say.
Very cool. And then last one is, what is one, like a very accessible, change or behavior that you think more people should adopt in order to, contribute to saving this planet? So think of something that is something, broadly accessible.
Yeah, well, I think, just washing your clothes in cold water, or even skipping the dry cycle and just kind of like letting your clothes hang dry, that really is hugely helpful in terms of just reducing emissions that you can personally impact.
Yeah, very cool. And I've been hang drying my clothes for about a couple of years. Although I sometimes get feedback from people that it has that like hang dry smell. I haven't figured out how to get rid of that yet. But,
have you ever used like white vinegar to wash your clothes with, or like if you hand wash them?
I definitely have not used vinegar to wash my clothes.
Okay, yeah, I guess that was a weird suggestion, but anyway. But yeah, I mean, I think just like doing things like simple things like that, like hand washing, or just considering just the little things really go a long way.
Awesome, great. Well, thank you, Alissa. Sorry for. I think it's the I instead of the Y that threw me off.
Okay.
Well, thank you for joining us and taking the time, and more importantly, thank you for the work you're doing to save this planet. It's super valuable, and I'm very excited. Even with or without being involved in a small way as an investor, I'm very excited to see what happens with Kintra and the impact that is in front of you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, James. We're honored to have you on our mission, and thank you for having me today.
Awesome. All right. Have a great night.